"Don't you dare touch my son again," Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper, yet sharp enough to cut through the entire room. Serena stood there with a red scratch on her wrist, staring at the tiny 2-year-old boy clinging to his mother's leg as if the world were ending. And in that gilded, silent mansion, it felt as though it might be. Nobody moved, nobody breathed. Julian Vale, the billionaire in his early 30s, sat in his wheelchair by the window and simply watched. The scratch wasn't deep. It wasn't even bleeding anymore. But the way Serena held her wrist up, the way her perfectly shaped mouth fell open in disbelief, you would have thought the child had taken a knife to her. "He bit me," Serena said, spinning around to face the room. "This woman's feral child bit me." "He scratched you," Elena said quietly, stepping forward and pulling Matteo behind her. "And he's 2 years old. I don't care how old he is." Serena's voice climbed. "This is not a daycare. This is a private residence, and that child should not be here." Matteo was still sniffling. He didn't understand what was happening. All he knew was that the tall woman with the cold perfume had grabbed his arm too hard when he reached for the vase on the table. He had done what any scared toddler would do. He had swung. Elena's hands were shaking. She had worked in the mansion for several months. She had scrubbed floors, ironed curtains, polished silverware, and never once been spoken to as anything more than invisible furniture. This was the first time she had spoken back, and she could feel the risk of it sitting heavy in her chest. "Elena," said Mrs. Ellison, the head housekeeper, stepping out from the hallway with wide eyes. "Maybe you should take Matteo to the back quarters." "No," said Julian. The word was subtle. It wasn't loud, but it stopped the entire room. Everyone turned to look at him. He was sitting in the wheelchair near the tall window, a gray blanket across his lap, his dark eyes fixed on the scene in front of him. He hadn't said anything until now. For the past few weeks, Julian Vale had barely spoken at all since the accident. According to everyone around him, he had retreated into himself. He sat in rooms. He let people talk over him. He stared out windows. But right now, he was not staring out the window. "Let the boy stay," Julian said simply. Serena turned to him. Something flickered across her face fast, like a light switching off and back on. Then she smiled, the kind of smile that was practiced. Expensive. "Julian, sweetheart," she said, walking toward him, her heels clicking on the marble. "I'm not asking for much. I'm asking for basic boundaries in our home." "It's my home," Julian said, "and the boy stays." Serena stopped walking. Her smile didn't disappear, but it hardened the way plaster dries. Elena kept her head down. She pulled Matteo closer and pressed her hand gently over his curls. He had stopped crying and was now watching Julian with a pure, unfiltered curiosity that only children have. He pointed one chubby finger at the wheelchair. "Man," Matteo announced. Nobody laughed, but something shifted in Julian's face. Not quite a smile, something quieter than that. "Mrs. Ellison," Elena said carefully, "I'll take him to the kitchen. I'm sorry for the disruption." "You don't need to apologize," Julian said again. Elena didn't know what to do with that. In several months of working here, Julian Vale had never once directed a sentence specifically at her. He had nodded when she brought him coffee. He had been quiet when she cleaned around him. She had learned to read his silences like a language. This one was different. Serena was watching her now with a kind of attention that felt less like interest and more like targeting. Elena picked Matteo up, settled him on her hip, and walked toward the kitchen without looking back. But she heard it. She heard Serena's voice drop low as soon as she thought Elena was out of range. "You're not seriously going to let this become a habit," Serena said. "Drop it," Julian said. "Julian." "I said drop it." Elena turned the corner. Her heart was pounding. Matteo patted her cheek with his small hand and said, "Mama?" the way he always did when he could tell something was wrong but didn't have the words for it yet. "I know, baby," she whispered. "I know." She set him down at the small table in the kitchen and gave him the little bag of crackers she kept in her apron pocket for exactly these kinds of moments. He accepted them, like a king accepting tribute, and got to work. Elena gripped the edge of the counter and tried to steady her breathing. She needed this job. That wasn't dramatic. It was just true. She had Matteo. She had a studio apartment 20 minutes away that she could only afford because of what this job paid. She had no family in this city, no backup plan, no safety net that wasn't already fully stretched. If Serena decided to make her a problem, she would become a problem. That was how these worlds worked. Elena had grown up watching her own mother navigate spaces like this, learning when to speak and when to disappear. She had spoken tonight. She hadn't disappeared. And somehow, impossibly, Julian Vale had backed her up. She didn't know what to do with that. She started washing the dishes from dinner, keeping her movements careful and quiet. The big house hummed around her. She could hear the distant sound of Serena's heels on marble moving through the east wing. She could hear the whir of Julian's wheelchair, which meant he was moving too, probably toward the elevator to go upstairs. What she couldn't figure out was why. Why had he spoken? Why had he looked at her like that? He had barely registered her existence for several months. She wasn't being self-pitying about it. She understood the dynamic. She was staff. He was Julian Vale, tech billionaire, a man whose name had appeared on every financial magazine cover for years. Now sitting in a wheelchair, following a car accident that his assistant, Walter, had told the staff was more serious than it looked. She hadn't asked what that meant. It wasn't her place to ask. Matteo finished his crackers, climbed down from the chair without asking, and walked over to her with his arms up. "Up, Mama." She dried her hands and lifted him. He curled against her shoulder, already getting heavy-eyed. The drama of the evening fading from him, the way it only fades for people who haven't yet learned to hold on to things. She envied him that. She carried him toward the small room she had been given access to for nights, when her shift ran late. It was barely more than a storage room with a cot, but it had a lock, and right now, a lock felt like enough. She didn't hear the wheelchair stop at the end of the hall. She didn't see Julian Vale watching her walk away, his hands still on the wheels, his expression something between calculation and something else, something he probably hadn't expected to feel tonight. And she definitely didn't see the moment just before he turned back toward the elevator when he pressed both feet flat against the footrest and stood up for just a second, checking his own balance, then sat back down and said nothing. By morning, Elena had convinced herself that last night was an anomaly. Julian had spoken up because Serena had been loud and disruptive, and he was a man who disliked disruption. That was it. She had read too much into it because she was scared and tired, and her brain had done what brains do when you're vulnerable. It had made something small feel significant. She repeated this to herself while she made his morning coffee. Black, no sugar, served in the white ceramic mug, not the glass one Serena had brought in from her apartment that she kept trying to install in the kitchen, like small flags of territory. She carried the tray to the sunroom where Julian spent his mornings. He was already there. He always was. She sometimes wondered if he slept in the chair, or if he woke before everyone else, just to be positioned before the world started watching him. She didn't ask. She set the tray down on the table beside him, the way she always did. "Thank you, Elena," he said. She froze. Not visibly. She had trained herself out of visible reactions years ago, but internally, something tripped. He had said her name. In several months, he had never said her name. "Of course, Mr. Vale," she said, and began to step back. "Sit down," he said. She turned. "I'm sorry?" "Pull that chair over and sit down, please." She looked at the small chair near the window. She looked at him. He was watching her with those dark, unreadable eyes, his coffee untouched, his hands loose in his lap. "Mr. Vale, I have the East Wing floors." They can wait," he said. 5 minutes." She pulled the chair over. She sat down. She folded her hands in her lap and waited because she genuinely did not know what else to do. He looked out the window for a moment. The morning light was coming in flat and pale. Outside, the grounds were perfectly kept. She knew because it was partly her job to make sure they were. "How old is your son?" he asked. 2, she said. "He'll be 3 soon." "What's his name?" "Matteo." Julian nodded slowly, like he was filing something away. "His father?" She kept her expression even. "Not in the picture." "I see." He didn't push. That surprised her. Most people pushed. "Does he come with you often?" "Only when I can't arrange childcare. I know it's not ideal. I've tried to make sure he doesn't. I'm not complaining, Julian said. He stopped, started again. I'm asking because if it's a regular issue, we can make a proper arrangement. There's a room near the kitchen that's not being used. If you need to bring him on certain days, he should have a proper space. Not whatever that closet situation was. Elena stared at him. How do you know about that room? She asked before she could stop herself. Something moved through his expression too fast to catch. I know most things that happen in this house, he said simply. She didn't know how to respond to that. She didn't know how to respond to any of this. She thought about what she knew about Julian Vale, tech company founder. Sold his first startup, young. Built the second one into something that appeared in every financial newspaper in the country, known as precise, private, and exacting. Not cruel. She had never seen cruelty in him, but not warm either. Until apparently now. Mr. Vale, she said carefully, I don't want any special treatment. I just want to keep doing my job without Serena making your life difficult, he said. She didn't answer. He picked up his coffee cup and took a sip. She's going to. I want you to know that has nothing to do with your performance or your position here. If she says or does anything that crosses a line, you come to me directly. Not Mrs. Ellison. Me. She stopped, started again. That puts me in a very uncomfortable position, Mr. Vale. I know, he said without apology. I'm asking you to be uncomfortable for a little while. Can you do that? She looked at him. This man, who had barely acknowledged her existence for several months, was now asking her to navigate something she didn't fully understand between him and the woman who wore his engagement ring and looked at Elena like she was a stain on the marble. I need this job, Elena said finally. That's the honest answer. I'll do what I need to do. Julian nodded. Honest, he said, almost to himself. Good. He looked back out the window, and she understood the conversation was over. She stood, pushed the chair back to its place, and walked toward the door. Elena, he said. She turned. Matteo is welcome in the kitchen whenever you need. Make sure Ms. Ellison knows. She nodded and left. She made it all the way to the hallway before she let herself exhale. She didn't see Serena standing at the top of the staircase above the sunroom's glass ceiling, looking down through the panes at both of them. She didn't see the expression on Serena's face. If she had, she would not have called it jealousy. Jealousy was too simple a word for it. It was something older and more deliberate than that. It was the face of someone already planning 3 moves ahead. Serena pulled out her phone and typed a message to someone. The name on the contact wasn't saved with a real name, just 2 initials. She sent it, slipped the phone back into her silk robe pocket, and went to get her own coffee. Meanwhile, in the sunroom, Julian Vale sat alone with his thoughts and his untouched cup, and flexed his right foot slowly under the blanket just to remind himself he still could. He had been pretending for several weeks. He could stop whenever he wanted. He just hadn't wanted to. Not yet. There was still something he needed to find out, and the wheelchair was the only way to find it out without showing his hand. He glanced at the doorway where Elena had just been standing. He hadn't expected her to be a complication, but then he was beginning to think she might be the most honest thing in this entire house. Serena moved fast when she decided to move. Elena noticed it in small things first. The coffee tray that went missing from the kitchen and reappeared in the wrong cupboard. The floor cleaner that had been replaced with a solution that left streaks, making it look like Elena hadn't done her job. The day Mrs. Ellison pulled her aside and said gently but firmly that there had been a complaint about Elena's attitude during the incident with the toddler. From who? Elena asked. Mrs. Ellison didn't answer. She didn't have to. Elena kept her face neutral. She nodded. She went back to work. She didn't go to Julian. Not yet. She didn't know what yet meant, or when it would become necessary. She just kept her head down and watched Serena the way you watch weather. Not panicking, just tracking. Serena was in her late 20s and beautiful in a very specific, deliberate way. Not the kind of beautiful that happened to you, but the kind you engineered over time. She wore her clothes like armor, and her smile like a tool. She called Julian sweetheart, in a voice that always felt slightly too loud for the room, as if she wanted to make sure whoever was nearby heard the ownership in it. She was also never still. That was what Elena noticed most. Even when Serena sat down, some part of her was moving, a finger tapping, her eyes scanning, her jaw set in a way that meant she was processing something. Elena recognized that kind of stillness under motion. She had learned it herself as a kid, growing up in a house where you always needed to know where the exits were. One morning, Serena appeared in the kitchen while Elena was making Mateo's breakfast. Mateo was sitting on the floor with a wooden spoon he had adopted as a toy, tapping it against the cabinet door with great satisfaction. Serena stopped in the doorway. She looked at the child, then at Elena. "He's here again." "My regular sitter had a conflict," Elena said. She kept her voice flat and her hands moving. "He won't be in any of the common areas." Mr. Vale approved his presence in the kitchen. Serena walked to the counter and poured herself a glass of water. Slowly, she leaned against the counter and watched Elena work. "How long have you been doing this?" Serena asked. "Doing what?" "Working in other people's homes." Elena put Mateo's little bowl of oatmeal on the floor near him and turned around. "Several years. I started when I was 20. "Why?" Serena tilted her head. "You're smart," she said. "You seem like a smart woman. Don't you want more than this?" Elena looked at her. "I want my son to eat breakfast and my bills to be paid right now. This is how I do both." "Julian is generous," Serena said. Her voice was careful, the way you are careful when you're testing ice. "He clearly likes you. People who get on Julian's good side tend to receive certain advantages." The air in the room changed. Elena kept her face very still. "Mr. Vale is my employer," she said. "I do my job. That's the extent of it." Serena smiled. It didn't reach her eyes. "I know," she said. "I just want to make sure we both understand each other. I'm going to be the woman in this house very soon, and I take care of the people who are loyal to me." She paused. "I also remember the ones who aren't." Mateo banged his spoon on the cabinet. The sound echoed. Serena looked at him. For just a second, one unguarded second, her face showed something that wasn't anger or strategy. It was something more like unease, like she didn't know what to do with a child who looked at her without fear. Then she put her glass down and walked out. Elena stood still for a moment, then she crouched down next to Mateo. "You doing okay, bub?" Mateo offered her the spoon. "Thanks," she said, and took it. She turned the spoon over in her hands and thought about what had just happened. Serena hadn't threatened her, not exactly. She had been too careful for that. But the message was clear enough. Pick a side, fall in line, and understand that the line was wherever Serena drew it. Elena was still thinking about this when she passed the hallway outside Julian's study that afternoon and heard voices through the door. She wasn't trying to listen. She was carrying a pile of folded linens and her hands were full, and she had slowed down to readjust her grip, but she heard it anyway. "The prenup needs to be modified," Serena was saying. "The current terms don't reflect our agreement." "We haven't discussed an agreement," Julian said. "Julian, we've discussed an engagement, which is a different thing. The prenup stands." "You're being difficult." "I'm being clear," Julian said. "There's a difference." Silence. "You don't trust me," Serena said. Her voice had gone softer. The weapon had changed. "I trust evidence," Julian said. "I haven't collected enough yet." Elena walked away quickly. Her pulse was loud in her ears. She didn't know what that conversation meant. She didn't know what evidence Julian was looking for, or why a man who supposedly couldn't walk was still sharp enough to hold that kind of line. But she was starting to understand that this house was not what it appeared to be from the outside, and she was in the middle of it whether she wanted to be or not. That night, after Mateo was asleep on the cot in the small kitchen room, Elena sat on the floor outside the door with her back against the wall and her phone in her hand. She had one text she wanted to send to her best friend Zara. It said, "Something is very wrong in this house and I don't know if I should stay." She typed it. She looked at it. Then she deleted it and typed, "Mateo did good today, made friends with a wooden spoon." She hit send. She sat with her back against the wall for another hour. She didn't hear the soft creak at the other end of the hall, where Julian's door was open exactly 2 inches, and a thin line of light fell across the floor toward her. The call came one morning, and Elena only overheard it because the window in the East Wing bathroom was open, and Serena was standing directly below it in the garden. Her voice carried upward in the cool air. Elena wasn't snooping. She had a bottle of cleaner in one hand and a cloth in the other, and she had been about to close the window to block the cold. But Serena's first words stopped her hand mid-reach. "He still thinks I don't know about the surveillance," Serena said. Elena stood very still. "Relax, I'm handling it. The prenup isn't going to be a problem once the marriage goes through, but I need more time. He's not as out of it as we thought." A pause. "No, the accident slowed him down, but it didn't change who he is. He's watching everything." Another pause, longer this time. "Because that's what he does. That's what he's always done. I knew that going in." Her voice dropped. "The maid is the issue. I don't know what he's told her or how much she's figured out. She needs to go before she becomes a problem. Just make it look like a performance issue. I'll handle Ms. Ellison." Elena lowered herself slowly, sitting on the edge of the tub, her legs no longer interested in holding her weight. She pressed both hands flat against her thighs to stop them shaking. She stayed in that bathroom for several minutes. She counted them. Then she stood up, finished cleaning the sink, and went downstairs like nothing had happened. She was good at that. She had been good at that for a long time. But her mind was moving, and it didn't stop moving all day. The accident. Julian's accident. The one that had put him in the wheelchair. Walter had told the staff it happened several weeks ago. A car accident, he had said. Private matter. Staff were asked not to ask questions. Elena had never asked. It wasn't her business. But now she was asking herself, not about the accident, but about the chair. She thought about the morning she had brought Julian his coffee, the way he sat. She had thought about this before, in the vague way you think about things you're not supposed to think about. There was something about the way he held himself in the chair that felt like a choice rather than a necessity. His arms were too controlled. His back was too straight. And that morning in the sunroom, when he had reached across the table for a book that had slid slightly to his left, he had shifted his whole body weight naturally, automatically, the way you only do when you trust your own lower half. She had noticed it. She had told herself she was wrong. Now she was wondering. She was also wondering what it meant that Serena knew about surveillance and wasn't running from it. She was thinking about what Julian had said. "I trust evidence. I haven't collected enough yet." She was thinking about the two initials on Serena's phone contact. She was thinking about Matteo asleep on a cot in a supply room, not knowing that the adults around him were playing a game whose rules she was still learning. She needed to be careful. She was still telling herself this when Julian's voice came from behind her. "Elena." She was in the hallway outside the library. She turned. He was in the doorway of the library, the chair angled toward her. "Can you come in for a moment?" She looked around. The hallway was empty. She went in. The library was the kind of room that felt insulated from the rest of the house. The shelves ran floor to ceiling. There were reading lamps in the corners that made the light feel amber and still. Julian moved to the center of the room and gestured to the chair across from him. Elena sat down. She kept her hands in her lap. "I need to ask you something directly," Julian said. "And I need you to answer me directly because I don't have time for anything else right now." "Okay," she said. "How much have you heard in this house?" She looked at him. She could feel the decision sitting in front of her, solid and immediate. "Enough," she said. Julian nodded. No reaction, like he had expected that answer. "And what have you done with what you've heard?" "Nothing," she said. "It's not my business." "It might need to become your business," he said. "Briefly, temporarily. And I would compensate you for it." "What does that mean?" He was quiet for a moment. "Serena is not who she says she is," he said carefully. "I've known that for a while. I'm in the process of confirming exactly what I know and finding the proof I need before I take any action. The engagement is not real. It's a container, something I'm using to keep a situation contained until I have what I need." Elena stared at him. "You're using your own engagement as a trap." "I'm protecting an asset," he said, "and then I'm going to burn the whole thing down." "What asset?" "My company," he said. "Serena is working with someone who is trying to acquire it through back channels, using our relationship as leverage, using information she's obtained about me privately." He paused. "I needed to know how far the access went. The wheelchair gave me cover. People say more when they think you're diminished." Elena felt the pieces land one by one. "You're not paralyzed," she said. He said nothing, which was its own answer. "You've been sitting in that chair for several weeks while watching everything." "Yes." Elena exhaled. She pressed her fingers against her temple. "And where do I come in?" "You don't have to," he said. "I want to be clear about that. If you want to walk away from this conversation and pretend it didn't happen, I'll respect that. I'll make sure your position here is protected regardless." "But," she said. "But you're already in it," he said. "Serena identified you as a loose end this morning. I need you to know that before she acts on it." Elena went very still. "She told someone to make it look like a performance issue." Julian's expression shifted. "You heard that?" "The East Wing bathroom window," Elena said quietly. She was in the garden. Something moved through his face that might have been the closest thing Julian Vale had to relief. "Then you already know," he said. "I know she wants me gone," Elena said. "I don't know what you want." Julian looked at her, and for the first time since she'd known him, since she'd moved through this house like a ghost, and he'd sat in rooms and barely acknowledged her, he looked at her without any kind of performance in his face. Just direct, just honest. "I want you to stay," he said. "I want Matteo to stay. And I want Serena to think that nothing has changed." Elena looked at him for a long moment. "You're asking me to trust you?" "I'm asking you to give me a few more days," he said. "That's all, a few more days." She thought about the studio apartment, the bills, Matteo's winter coat she hadn't bought yet. She thought about Serena's voice through the window. She thought about Julian saying her name for the first time several months into her job, as if he'd been waiting for the right moment. "Fine," she said. The next morning, Elena acted like nothing had changed. She made the coffee. She carried the tray. She cleaned the rooms. She kept Matteo in the kitchen, where he had started a complicated relationship with a rubber spatula, and seemed content with this. Serena was watching her. Elena felt it the way you feel sun on skin. Not unpleasant exactly, but constant. Serena walked past doorways that Elena was cleaning and didn't stop, just tracked her with her eyes. She asked questions that sounded casual and weren't. She complimented Elena's work in a way that felt like circling. Elena kept her face open and soft. She said, "Thank you." She smiled when it was appropriate. On the second day, the thing with Mrs. Ellison happened. Elena was called into the small office off the kitchen, where Mrs. Ellison kept the household ledgers and the duty rosters. Mrs. Ellison sat across the desk with her hands folded and her expression carefully neutral. And she told Elena that there had been concerns raised about her reliability, that bringing Matteo to work was a disruption, that her manner with the household guests had been noted as occasionally inappropriate. Elena said, "Has Mr. Vale been informed of these concerns?" Ms. Ellison paused. "Mr. Vale's health makes it difficult to—" "Has he been informed?" Elena asked again gently. Another pause. "I haven't spoken to him directly." "No. I'd like to request that before any formal action is taken, the concerns be brought to Mr. Vale directly," Elena said. "I believe that's within my rights as a staff member." Mrs. Ellison looked at her for a long time. Then she said, "I'll note your request." Elena thanked her and left. She didn't look at Serena when she passed her in the hallway. She looked at the floor the way a woman who was slightly worried would look. She had learned how to perform being slightly worried without becoming it. That afternoon, she passed a note to Julian through the method they had worked out. A folded piece of paper slipped under a specific book on the library shelf. She wrote, "Mrs. Ellison meeting request made as planned. Serena is accelerating." 2 hours later, the book had been moved a few inches to the left. That was the signal. She understood it. Stay the course. On the fourth day, Matteo caused another incident. It wasn't his fault. It was the kind of thing that happened with 2-year-olds in large houses, full of things that looked interbeasting and weren't for touching. He had found his way out of the kitchen. Elena had been refilling linens 2 rooms away for a few minutes, and he had wandered down the hall. He ended up in the sitting room. Serena was in the sitting room with a man Elena had never seen before. He was in his 40s, gray suit, the kind of face that belonged in a boardroom. They were talking in low voices over papers spread across the coffee table. Matteo toddled in and looked at the papers with great interest. The man in the gray suit said, "What is—" Serena stood up fast. "How did he get in here?" she said, her voice going sharp and hard. Matteo, startled, grabbed the edge of the closest paper and crumpled it. Serena stepped toward him. She reached out. She grabbed his wrist. Matteo cried out. Elena was in the doorway seconds later. She didn't know how she moved so fast, only that she did. Some part of her that was permanently wired to her child's sounds of distress. She was across the room before Serena had time to process she was there. "Don't touch him again," Elena said. Her voice was different this time. Not afraid, not performing, just absolute. She scooped Matteo up, checked his wrist, which was red but not hurt. And then she turned and looked at the man in the gray suit. She recognized him. She didn't know from where, not specifically, but she knew the type. She had seen enough of them on news sites, in the background of photographs, at the edges of the kind of stories that started with acquisitions and ended with people losing their jobs. The papers on the table were partially visible. She didn't stare. She looked for 1 second. She saw Julian's company name. She saw figures. She looked at Serena. Serena looked back at her and said very quietly, "You need to leave this room." "I'm taking my son," Elena said. "We're leaving the room." She walked out. She walked directly, calmly, all the way to the library. She put Matteo down. She moved the book. She waited. Minutes later, Julian's chair appeared in the doorway. "Gray suit," she said. "Sitting room. Papers on the table. Acquisition documents, I think. I only had a second." Julian looked at her. "Did he see you look?" "Serena did," Elena said. "The man didn't." Julian nodded slowly. He pulled out his phone. He made a call. He said 3 sentences that Elena didn't fully understand, but that sounded like the final pieces of something clicking into place. Then he hung up. He sat for a moment. Then he looked at her. "A few more days is up," he said. "I know," she said. "Stay here," he said. "Keep Matteo here." He turned the chair toward the door. And then he did something that Elena had expected and not expected at the same time. He stood up. It happened without drama, without announcement. He just put his hands on the armrests, pushed, straightened, and stood like a man who had been sitting down for a long time and was finally done sitting. He was taller than she'd realized, 6 feet at least. He straightened his shirt. He looked back at her. "Thank you," he said. Then he walked out into the hallway, his footsteps quiet on the marble toward the sitting room. Elena sat on the floor next to Matteo, who was already investigating the bottom shelf of the library with deep scholarly interest. She pressed her hand over her heart and waited. She heard voices. Julian's first, calm and direct. Then the man in the gray suit, a startled sound, something shifting in pitch. Then Serena, sharp, and then suddenly very quiet. She heard a door close. She heard nothing for several minutes. Then she heard Julian's voice again, closer now, saying something she couldn't make out to someone on the phone. Matteo pulled a book off the shelf and handed it to her. "Read," he said. Elena took the book. She opened it. Her hands were still shaking, just slightly. She read him the first page, then the second. She was on the third when Julian appeared back in the doorway. He looked at her, then at Matteo, then at the book. "Is that a good one?" he asked. "It's about a bear," Matteo said. "Sounds excellent," Julian said. It took another few days for everything to fully unravel, though unravel was the wrong word. It unwound. It was deliberate and controlled the way Julian apparently did everything, as if chaos was just a form of order that hadn't been organized yet. The man in the gray suit, Elena learned eventually, was named Victor Lang. He was a corporate broker who had been working with a competing firm for months to acquire Julian's company through a manufactured personal crisis. The plan had been to use Serena's inside access to Julian's life, his schedule, his vulnerabilities, to force a situation where a private sale would be his only option. The wheelchair was supposed to be evidence of that vulnerability. A CEO who was incapacitated. A company that needed new direction. They had expected Julian to be slower, to miss things, to need Serena more. They had been very wrong about all 3. Julian's legal team arrived at the house one morning. Serena was present when they arrived. She tried the smile first, then the tears, then the kind of controlled anger that believed its own performance. None of it worked on people who had been briefed by Julian Vale in the previous days. She left with her belongings in 3 suitcases and the engagement ring sitting on the hall table. Elena watched from the second-floor window, Matteo on her hip, his chin on her shoulder. "Where lady going?" Matteo asked. "Home," Elena said. "She's going home." "Okay," Matteo said, satisfied with this, and pointed at a bird on the garden wall. Later that afternoon, Mrs. Ellison found Elena in the kitchen and apologized. It was brief, and slightly uncomfortable, and completely sincere. Elena accepted it the same way, briefly, with as little ceremony as possible. Walter, Julian's assistant, appeared after that, and told her that Mr. Vale would like to see her in the sunroom when she had a moment. She took Matteo with her. She wasn't sure why. Instinct, maybe. Julian was sitting in the sunroom in a regular chair this time, the kind that didn't have wheels. He had a cup of coffee and a stack of papers, and he looked like a man who had stopped performing something and was simply being. He looked younger, strangely, like the pretense had been the heavier thing. "Sit down," he said. "Please." She sat. Matteo climbed immediately onto the chair beside her like he'd been doing it for years, and looked at Julian with wide, interested eyes. "I owe you an explanation," Julian said. "You owe me nothing," Elena said. "You were honest with me when it mattered. I was late being honest with you," he said. "I should have told you sooner what was happening in this house." "Would it have changed anything?" "Probably not," he admitted, "but you would have had more information to protect yourself with." Elena looked at her hands. "I would like to keep my job," she said, "if that's still on the table. I like the work. I'm good at it, and I need it." "Your job is yours as long as you want it," Julian said. "I've also adjusted your compensation retroactive to your start date because you've been handling more than your job description for several months." She looked up at him. "Julian," she said. "Mr. Vale," he corrected with something in his voice that was not entirely serious. "Mr. Vale," she said, "you don't have to." "I'm aware I don't have to," he said. "That's what makes it different from what Serena was doing." They sat with that for a moment. Matteo slid off his chair, walked to Julian's chair, and put his hand on Julian's knee without preamble, in the way that toddlers do things, without strategy, without performance, without any filter between feeling and action. Julian looked down at him. Matteo pointed at the coffee cup. "Hot," he announced. "Very hot," Julian confirmed. Matteo nodded, satisfied at having contributed this information, and went to investigate the corner of the room where a lamp had an interesting base. Julian looked at Elena. Elena was already looking at him. "Are you actually okay?" she asked. "After all of it, the company thing, Serena." He was quiet for a moment. She appreciated that he didn't answer immediately. It meant the answer was real. "I'm better than I was," he said. "I was angry for a long time. I channeled it into the problem because that was the only useful thing to do with it." He paused. It's strange to not be performing anymore. The chair. The silence. It became a habit. "Which part?" she asked. "The silence," he said. "It was easier not to talk to people when I was watching them. So why did you start talking to me?" He looked at her for a moment, direct, honest. The way he had been in the library, without the careful layer of distance. "Because you told Serena not to touch your son," he said. "And you were terrified when you said it, and you said it anyway. And I thought..." He stopped. "I thought that was the most honest thing I'd seen in a long time." Elena didn't have a response to that. She sat with it. Matteo appeared back at Julian's knee and offered him a rubber band he had found on the floor. Julian took it gravely. "Thank you," he said. "Welcome," Matteo said, and toddled away. Elena pressed her lips together. She was not going to let herself feel too much about this. She was a young mother with a toddler and a studio apartment and a job in this house. And Julian Vale was a billionaire who had just dismantled a corporate conspiracy from a wheelchair he didn't need. They were not a situation. They were two people who had been through something strange together and come out the other side. That was enough. It was also, she thought, the beginning of something she didn't have a name for yet. "I should get back to work," she said. "You don't have to today," he said. "I want to," she said. "It's the kind of day where I need something normal to do." He nodded. "I understand that." She stood. Matteo had found her from across the room through some toddler tracking system and appeared at her legs. "Up," he said. She picked him up. She was at the door when Julian said her name again. She turned. "Thank you," he said, "for staying for those few days." Elena looked at him. at this man who had been watching a house full of people from a chair, waiting for truth, and had found it partly in a maid who couldn't afford not to be honest. "You're welcome, Mr. Vale," she said. And this time when she walked away, she wasn't holding her breath. She wasn't counting exits. She was just walking through the sunlit hallway of a house that still had too many rooms and too much quiet, but felt somehow like somewhere she might actually belong. Matteo waved over her shoulder at Julian as they went. Julian raised his hand, and in the whole long, strange time that followed, the lawsuits, the press, the rebuilding of a company, and the slow, quiet thing that grew between two very different people who had chosen honesty at inconvenient moments, Elena always said it started there, not with the scratch, not with the wheelchair, with a toddler offering a rubber band to a billionaire, and a man accepting it like it was worth something, because it was.